Good evening and welcome. Settle in wherever you are and let the day loosen its hold on you. Tonight, let me tell you a story, the whole long story of how 13 small and scattered colonies, clinging to the edge of a vast and half-known continent, quarreled with the greatest empire on earth, and in the quarreling became something the world had never quite seen before, a nation that belonged to its people. It is a long story, and I mean to tell it slowly, the way stories are best told at the close of a day. There is no hurry now. You have nowhere to be but here. This story does not begin where you might expect. It does not open in a marble hall with a president rising to speak. It does not begin at a White House set behind iron gates, nor with a famous sheet of parchment, its bold signatures curling across the bottom. Those things come later, and some of them come very late indeed. Set them aside for now. Let the grand pictures dissolve, and let your mind drift somewhere smaller, quieter, and far more ordinary than any of them. It begins instead on a cold, gray spring morning on a small village green in a place called Lexington in the year 1775. A few dozen tired farmers stood clustered on the grass, muskets in hand, their breath showing in the chill. Facing them, drawn up in neat scarlet ranks, stood the finest soldiers in the world. Neither side that morning meant for anything terrible to happen. The men on the green did not truly wish to fight. The soldiers had not marched out to kill their cousins. Yet there they stood, close enough to see one another's faces, waiting. And then a single shot rang out across the green. To this day, no one knows whose finger pulled that trigger or whether it was meant at all. It may have been an accident, a musket jarred loose in a nervous hand. But once it had sounded, it could not be unsound. In that thin crack of powder and smoke, a scattered people, farmers and shopkeepers, printers and preachers, spread thin along a wild coast, began an improbable journey none of them had planned, toward a destination none of them could yet imagine. What followed was not swift, and it was not easy. 8 long years of war lay ahead. 8 years of marching and hunger, of frozen winters and empty stomachs, of hopes raised high and dashed again. The army that fought that war was ragged and often barefoot, poorly fed and rarely paid. It lost far more battles than it ever won. Time and again it was scattered, chased, and nearly destroyed. And yet, somehow, it would not stop. It kept gathering itself back together in the dark and rising to fight once more. Holding that army together was a tall, quiet man from Virginia, a planter who spoke little and endured much, whose stubborn patience became, in the end, a kind of miracle. His name you likely already know, though we will come to it gently. And behind the muskets and the marching lay something else, just as powerful. Daring words set down on paper. Words about liberty, about equality, about the plain idea that ordinary people might govern themselves. Fragile words written by candlelight, and strong enough to outlast the empire they defied. But do not worry over any of this tonight. There will be no test in the morning. You need not hold the names or keep the dates in order or remember which battle came before which. That is my work, not yours. Your only task is to rest. Let the story wash over you like a slow tide, in and out, taking a little more of your wakefulness with each turn. If your eyes grow heavy and the words begin to blur together, that is exactly as it should be. Let them carry you gently down toward sleep. If you find that these quiet histories bring you rest night after night, you might think of subscribing to Lamplight History, but only if it truly helps you sleep. There is no need and no hurry. I would far rather you drift off before the end than stay awake to press a button. The stories will keep. They will be here tomorrow night, and the night after that, waiting for you whenever you need a soft voice in the dark. And if some small part of you is still awake and curious, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight and what hour it is where you lie. A city at midnight, a farmhouse before dawn, a quiet room where rain is falling. Leave a word in the comments if you like, and tell me. It is a strange and lovely thing to think of so many people in so many places, all drifting toward the same sleep to the same old story. Now, let us begin where the story truly starts, not with the fighting, but with the land, long before any shot was fired. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the great gray ocean, the wide Atlantic, rolling on for weeks between the old world and the new. In those days, a crossing took a month or more, a small wooden ship pitching alone beneath enormous skies. For everyone who lived on the far shore, that ocean was the road home to Britain, and also the vast moat that kept Britain 3,000 miles away. And on the far side of that ocean lay the coast, 3,000 miles of wild, wooded shoreline, dark forests crowding almost to the water's edge. Behind the thin fringe of settlement stood woods so deep no European had walked their whole length, home to nations who had lived there far longer than any newcomer. Rivers wound down through the trees to meet the sea. Salt marshes shone at low tide. It was a green and shaggy country, only half tamed, and it smelled of pine and brine and wood smoke. Strung along that coast, like a handful of beads laid loosely on a table, were the 13 colonies. In the north lay New England, rocky and cold. In the middle sat New York and Pennsylvania and their neighbors, busy and mixed. Down south stretched Virginia and the Carolinas and Georgia, warm and broad. They were not a single country, not yet, not by any measure. They were 13 separate places, each looking across the water to London far more than they looked at one another. And it was a young country, this new world, young and rough and only half tamed. Compared to the ancient cities of Europe, with their cathedrals and their centuries of stone, the colonies were scarcely more than a clearing in the woods. Their towns were small, their roads were mud, and beyond the last fence lay wilderness that seemed to have no end. Yet the people who lived there were finding, without quite noticing, that the wideness of the land was changing them, loosening the old ways, making them freer, plainer, more their own. picture the everyday piece of it in the years before the storm. A farmer walks his fields at dusk, the smell of turned earth rising around him. Cattle low in a far pasture. In a village, candles come alight one window at a time as evening settles in. Somewhere a woman sings low to a child. Smoke drifts straight up from the chimneys in the still air. For most people, most of the time, life was small and near at hand. The seasons, the harvest, the meeting house on Sunday, the faces they had known since birth. They did not think of themselves as rebels, these people, nor as founders of anything. They thought of themselves, most of them, as loyal subjects of the king, proud to be his, glad to be part of something so large and so old. The great quarrel had not yet come. The land lay quiet under its wide sky, the way a house lies quiet in the last hour before anyone is awake. All that would change, but slowly and not yet. For now there was only the peace and the coming night. So let the peace of that old country settle over you now, as we begin. Dim the lights if they are not already low. Rest your head against the pillow and let your shoulders sink. Breathe in slowly and let it out slower still. There is nothing you need to do and nowhere you need to go. The fire is banked, the door is barred, and the long night stretches ahead with all the time in the world. Let us go back, then gently to those 13 scattered colonies, and see how they lived before the dawn. Let us walk, then, into the world of the colonies as it was around the middle of the 1700s, the 1750s, say, a full generation before any thought of revolution. Perhaps 2 million people lived along that long coast in those years. 2 million souls, scattered thin over an enormous land. And nearly all of them, 9 in every 10, lived by the soil. They were farmers, close to the ground and close to the seasons, their whole lives shaped by when to plant and when to reap, by rain and frost and the slow turning of the year. Yet these 2 million were not one people. They lived, in truth, in several different worlds, each with its own weather and its own way of being. Begin in the north, in New England, where the winters bit hard and the ground gave up its crops grudgingly. The towns there were stern and tidy, laid out with care, and at the heart of each stood a white wooden church, its steeple pointing up into the cold blue sky. Around it lay the village green, cropped short by grazing sheep, and around that clustered the neat clapboard houses. In those New England towns there grew a habit that would matter greatly one day, the town meeting. When there were roads to mend, or a schoolmaster to hire, or a dispute to settle, the men of the town would gather in the meeting house and talk it through, and then they would vote, each man's voice counting the same as his neighbor's. It was plain, ordinary self-government, no grand thing at all. But it taught people week by week and year by year that they had a say in how they were governed, and that lesson, once learned, is very hard to unlearn. Now let your mind travel south away, into the middle colonies, and feel how the air changes. Here everything was busier, more crowded, more mixed. At the center of it stood Philadelphia, the largest city in all the colonies. its streets laid out in a neat grid, its wharves crowded with ships, its shops and printing houses humming with trade and talk. To the north lay New York, gathered around one of the finest harbors in the world, where the masts of vessels stood as thick as a winter forest, and goods flowed in and out from every corner of the earth. And the people of the middle colonies were mixed as nowhere else. Dutch families who had been there since New York was New Amsterdam. Germans farming the rich Pennsylvania land. Quakers in their plain gray coats, who had founded Pennsylvania on the strange, gentle idea of tolerance. Scotch-Irish pushing out toward the frontier. Small communities of Jews in the port towns. They worshipped in a dozen different ways, spoke in a dozen different accents, and somehow lived side by side. Not always in perfect harmony, but together, which in that age was remarkable enough. Travel south again into the warm plantation country of Virginia and the Carolinas and Georgia, and the world changes once more. Here the summers were long and heavy, and the land was given over to great crops raised for sale far away. Tobacco in Virginia, rice in the low country of Carolina, indigo for the deep blue dyes that Europe craved. Along the wide rivers stood gracious houses of brick and white column, set among lawns and gardens, where a small class of planters lived in an ease and grandeur unmatched anywhere else in the colonies. But that grace and ease rested upon a deep and bitter wrong, and it would be false to tell this story without it. The wealth of the plantation South was built by the forced labor of enslaved men and women, brought across the ocean in chains from Africa, torn from their homes and families and sold like goods. They cleared the fields and raised the crops and built the fine houses, and received nothing for it. Not freedom, not wages, not even the right to keep their own children beside them. Their suffering was real and heavy and must not be softened or forgotten. And here lies one of the aching contradictions at the very heart of our story. For while some men spoke grandly of liberty and would soon fight and die for it, others, sometimes the very same men, held human beings in bondage on their own land. The enslaved longed for freedom as deeply as anyone who ever lived. More deeply, perhaps, for they knew its absence in their bones. Their own long yearning for liberty runs all through the years ahead, quietly, beneath the louder tale. Remember it. It belongs to this story as truly as any battle. So there they were, 13 separate societies, 13 little worlds, strung out along a single coast. And it is worth saying plainly, they did not always like one another. The proud Virginian looked down a little on the plain New Englander. The bustling merchant of Boston thought the Southern planter idle. Each colony guarded its own borders, its own trade, its own peculiar ways, and none of them thought of the others as countrymen. If you had told a Carolina rice planter that he was brother to a Massachusetts fisherman, he would have laughed. And yet, slowly, almost without anyone deciding it, they were becoming something new. The long ocean lay between them and Britain, and distance does its quiet work. Cut off from the old country by 3,000 miles of sea, the colonists had to shift for themselves, solve their own troubles, run their own affairs. A person born in the colonies, of English blood but colonial upbringing, was not quite an Englishman of the old sort any longer. Something in the wide land and the long distance was making a new kind of people, though they scarcely knew it yet. Chief among the things that shaped them was the long, deep habit of governing themselves. Every one of the 13 colonies had its own assembly, a gathering of representatives, elected by the colonists themselves, that met to make the colony's laws. And these assemblies held one power above all others that they guarded fiercely: the power of the purse. Each colony voted its own taxes, decided how much its own people should pay and for what. For generations this had simply been the way of things, as natural as the change of seasons. Britain, for the most part, had let all this be. Busy with its own great affairs and its wars in Europe, the mother country had ruled the colonies with a light and distracted hand, a policy that came later to be called salutary neglect. The laws on the books were often strict, but they were loosely enforced, and much was quietly overlooked. Left largely alone, the colonies had flourished. They grew used to a freedom no one had exactly granted them, but no one had troubled to take away either. Felt by long custom like a right. And so the colonists came to hold, with real and stubborn pride, a certain picture of themselves. They were freeborn Englishmen, that was the phrase they loved. Not conquered subjects, not lesser folk, but heirs to the ancient liberties of England, the rights their forefathers had wrung from kings across the centuries. And chief among those rights, the one they held most sacred, was this: that no free Englishman could be taxed except by his own consent, given through his own chosen representatives. To take a man's property without his leave was, to their minds, the very mark of a slave. So hold that thought as we come to the edge of the great quarrel. For generations the colonies had taxed themselves, through their own assemblies, and Britain had let them. But what if that were to change? What if a parliament far across the sea, in which no colonist sat and for which no colonist had ever voted, should reach out one day and lay a tax upon them directly? By what right, the colonists would ask, by what right? It is a small question in the way it is first spoken. But it would grow and grow until it shook an empire. For tonight, though, let it rest. Let it wait until tomorrow with the rest. The trouble, when it came, grew out of a war, a great war fought years before the Revolution, on the very edge of the colonists' world. The French held Canada to the north and the Mississippi lands to the west, and between the French and the English lay the deep forests and the contested rivers of the frontier. In 1754, the long rivalry burst into open fighting. In the colonies they called it the French and Indian War. Across the wider world it grew into the 7 Years' War, a struggle that would reach across whole continents and oceans. It was a strange and difficult war, fought far from the tidy battlefields of Europe. Men marched through dark, trackless forests where the trees closed overhead like a roof, and crossed rivers half frozen in the raw spring cold. The native nations of the interior were drawn into it on every side, some allied with the French, some with the British, each seeking to guard their own lands and their own future against a rising tide of newcomers. It was a war of ambush and wilderness, of long marches and sudden alarms, quite unlike anything the Redcoats had known at home. And it was in this war that a young Virginian first learned the trade of arms, a tall, grave officer of the colonial militia, just past 20, named George Washington. His first campaigns did not go well. He was young and made a young man's mistakes and more than once found himself outmatched. But something in him was already plain to those who watched. In the chaos of an ambush, with men falling around him, he stayed strangely calm. Bullets tore through his coat and killed the horses beneath him, and still he sat steady, giving his orders in an even voice. The war ground on for years, but in the end Britain won, and won completely. By 1763, the French power in North America was broken and swept away. Canada passed to the British Crown. The vast lands beyond the mountains lay open. France, so long the great rival, was gone from the continent almost entirely. And the colonists rejoiced. They were Britons, and Britain had triumphed. They cheered their young king, George III, newly come to the throne, and felt themselves proud members of the mightiest empire on earth. Never had they felt closer to the mother country than in that hour of shared victory. But victory, as it turned out, carried a heavy price, and the bill came due soon after the cheering died away. Wars are ruinously costly things, and this one had been vast. Britain emerged triumphant but staggering under an enormous debt, greater than the nation had ever carried before. And the burden did not end with the fighting. Those new-won lands still had to be defended, garrisoned, held. Soldiers posted along the frontier, forts manned, all of it paid for year after year, long after the last shot of the war had faded into silence. And so, in the halls of government in London, a thought took shape that seemed, to the men who held it, only fair and reasonable. The war, after all, had been fought in good part to defend the colonies, to push back the French, to secure the frontier, to protect the very people now living safely along the coast. Was it not right, then, that the colonies should help to bear the cost? Should they not pay some modest share toward their own defense and the great debt raised on their behalf? Put so, in a quiet London office, it sounded like plain common sense. The first steps were small ones. The customs service, long lax and easygoing, was tightened up. For years the colonial merchants had carried on a brisk and cheerful smuggling, slipping goods past the tax collectors with a wink, and everyone had more or less looked the other way. Now suddenly the customs men grew strict. Ships were searched, papers demanded, old winked at, habits punished. To the merchants it felt less like the correcting of a fault than the breaking of a bargain, a sudden hardening of a hand that had always, before, been loose upon them. Then, in the year 1765, came the measure that truly lit the fire, the Stamp Act. It was on its face a simple thing. Henceforth, a great many printed items throughout the colonies would have to bear an official stamp, a stamp that had to be bought and paid for in British coin. Newspapers required it. Legal documents required it. Licenses, contracts, pamphlets, even playing cards, all of them, to be lawful, must carry the little mark that showed the tax had been paid. It reached into nearly every colonist's daily life at once. Now, the sums involved were not large. For most people, the actual cost of the stamps was a small thing, a few pennies here and there. And that is exactly what puzzled the men in London when the storm broke over their heads. Why should so modest a tax rouse such fury? But they had misread the matter entirely. It was never truly about the money. It was about who had the right to reach into a colonist's pocket at all. And that struck at something the colonists held sacred, struck, as they saw it, at the very heart of their liberty. For here at last was the thing they had always feared. This tax was laid upon them not by their own assemblies, in which they had a voice, but by a parliament 3,000 miles away, in which no colonist sat and for which no colonist had ever cast a vote. It was, to their minds, taxation without their consent, and if Parliament could do this small thing without asking them, then it could do anything, and their boasted liberties were worth nothing at all. From town to town the same clear cry began to rise, plain enough for a child to grasp. No taxation without representation. And then something happened that had never happened before. The colonies, those 13 jealous, separate, quarrelsome little worlds, began, for the very first time, to act together. In the autumn of 1765, delegates from 9 of the colonies gathered in New York in what they called the Stamp Act Congress. They sat down together, men who had never thought of one another as countrymen, and they drew up a common statement of their rights and their grievances. It was a small gathering and a cautious one, but it was a beginning, and everyone sensed it. Out of doors, meanwhile, the resistance took a rougher and more spirited form. In town after town, bands of ordinary men began to gather, craftsmen, sailors, shopkeepers, calling themselves the Sons of Liberty. They met, by tradition, beneath great spreading elms that came to be known as Liberty trees, and they made it their business to see that not a single stamp could be sold. The men appointed to sell them found their windows dark and their courage failing. One by one, up and down the coast, the stamp men quietly resigned, and the hated stamps stayed locked away, unused. In the face of all this, Britain gave way. The Stamp Act had become impossible to enforce and ruinous to trade, and in 1766, little more than a year after passing it, Parliament repealed it. When the news crossed the ocean, the colonies erupted in pure joy. Bells rang, bonfires blazed on the hills, toasts were drunk to the king and to Parliament and to liberty all at once. It seemed the quarrel was over, the danger past. The colonists felt themselves freeborn Englishmen still, their rights defended, their king benevolent, the old harmony restored. But in the very same breath that it repealed the tax, Parliament said something cold and quiet that few in the colonies stopped to hear amid the celebrating. It passed another act, the Declaratory Act, announcing that Parliament held, and would always hold, the full right to make laws binding the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The tax was gone, yes, but the claim behind it remained whole and unbroken, simply set aside for another day. The quarrel had not been settled. It had only been postponed. And so, on that note, let us rest, and let tomorrow's night take up the rest. For a little while after the Stamp Act was lifted, the colonies breathed easier. Bells that had rung in mourning now rang in thanks, and men who had feared for their livelihoods went back to their shops and their fields with lighter hearts. You might have thought the quarrel was over, and many, on both sides of the ocean, gently told themselves it was. But quarrels between the proud are rarely settled so simply. Beneath the calm, the old question still lay unanswered, like a stone under still water: who truly had the right to reach into a colonist's pocket, and how far that hand might one day stretch. Then, in the year 1767, word crossed the Atlantic once more. A man named Charles Townshend, keeper of Britain's purse, had found a fresh way to raise money from the colonies. Not a stamp this time, but small taxes laid quietly upon everyday things sailing into American ports. The glass in a window, the paint on a house, the paper a letter was written on, and the tea steeping in the evening pot. He believed the colonists would swallow such duties without complaint, since they touched only trade at the water's edge. He had, you will find, misjudged them badly, and the misjudging would cost his empire dear. The colonists, however, had grown careful readers of their own rights. They saw that a tax was a tax, whether stamped upon a document or hidden in the price of a window pane, and that consent had still never been asked. A quiet, thoughtful man of Pennsylvania, John Dickinson, took up his pen and wrote a series of gentle letters, signing himself a plain farmer. In patient, reasoned words he explained the danger to ordinary people, and his letters were read aloud by firesides from Georgia to New Hampshire. Slowly, without shouting, a shared understanding spread that this small tax carried a very large principle inside it. And so the colonists reached not for muskets, but for something far quieter and, in its way, far stronger. If they could not lawfully be forced to pay, they reasoned, then they simply would not buy. Why fight over the price of a thing you had chosen to do without? It was a weapon anyone could wield: the shopkeeper, the farmer's wife, the ship's captain, the child sent to market. No blood, no cannon, only the steady, stubborn refusal of a whole people to spend their coins where they were being wronged. There is a great power in the word no when many mouths say it together. Merchants in the busy ports, in Boston and New York, in Philadelphia and Charleston, began to gather and put their names to solemn agreements. They pledged not to import British goods until the hated duties were taken away. It was no small sacrifice, for these were the very wares that filled their shelves and fed their families. To sign was to choose principle over profit, at least for a season. Ledgers that had brimmed with orders for English cloth and china grew thin. The signatures spread from town to town, each merchant knowing his neighbor watched to see if he would keep his word. But the true heart of this quiet resistance beat inside the ordinary home, and it was often the women who kept it beating. In countless kitchens and parlors, mothers and daughters looked at the fine imported cloth they could no longer buy and simply decided to make their own. Out came the spinning wheels, and the low, patient hum of the treadle filled the evenings, turning wool and flax into rough, honest homespun. To wear plain cloth of your own making became a badge of pride, worn openly, even boastfully. What had been a humble chore was now, gently and without a single shot, an act of love for a cause. And where there had been tea, there was now the garden and the meadow. Since the leaf itself carried the tax, women learned to brew their evening cup from what grew close at hand, from raspberry leaf and sage, from mint and dried herbs gathered along the fences. They called it Liberty Tea, and though it never quite matched the old flavor, it warmed the hands and settled the heart just the same. Around these humble pots, the household became a small fort of conviction. A cup of homegrown tea, sipped by candlelight, said as plainly as any speech, "We will not be ruled without our leave." Across the ocean, the effect was felt in cold pounds and shillings. British merchants who sold to America watched their orders wither, their goods pile unwanted in the warehouses, their own profits fade. And these merchants had a voice in Parliament, and they used it, grumbling that this policy was ruining them for the sake of a little revenue. The boycott, so soft and homely in its beginnings, a spinning wheel here, a refused shipment there, had reached all the way to London and begun to pinch the empire itself. It is a curious thing, how the smallest daily choices, gathered up, can shake a distant throne. The king's ministers, stung and stubborn, decided that Boston in particular needed a firmer hand. And so, in the autumn of 1768, ships came into the harbor carrying not goods but soldiers, regiments of the regular army in their bright red coats, sent to overawe a town that would not behave. You can imagine the strange, uneasy sight. Rows of armed men marching down streets where children played, tents and drilling on the common, sentries posted at the corners of a peaceful trading town. Boston had asked for no army and welcomed none. To live now was to live watched, and the watching bred a slow, simmering resentment. Day by day, the friction of it wore on everyone. The soldiers, far from home and poorly paid, took odd jobs about the town and so seemed to steal the bread of local workmen. Boys jeered at the redcoats in the streets. The redcoats jeered back. Small insults passed like sparks. A shove at a doorway, a hard word at a tavern, a name flung across an alley. Neither side was wholly wicked, and neither wholly innocent. They were simply two peoples pressed too closely together, one feeling occupied and the other feeling despised. Everyone sensed that such closeness could not last without something giving way. It gave way on a bitter, freezing night in early March of 1770. Snow lay hard-packed and icy in the streets, and a crowd had gathered before the custom house, where a lone sentry stood his post. Words were thrown first, taunts, curses, a rising jeer, and then snowballs and lumps of ice and bits of frozen refuse. More soldiers came out to stand beside the sentry, their muskets loaded, hemmed in by an angry, shouting press of townsfolk in the flickering dark. No one, it seems, had quite meant for the night to go where it went. Fear and cold and fury tangled together, and then, in an instant of confusion, muskets fired into the crowd. When the smoke had thinned and the crowd had scattered back, 5 men of Boston lay fallen in the trampled snow. It had lasted only moments, this thing, yet those moments would echo for years. The town woke in shock and grief. The bells tolled, and the fallen were carried through the streets in a great solemn procession while the whole city mourned. Whatever had truly happened in that dark and frightened minute, the meaning of it was seized at once. The Sons of Liberty gave the night a name that would never let it be forgotten. They called it gravely and deliberately a massacre. A silversmith named Paul Revere set the scene into a copper engraving. Soldiers in a tidy line firing upon unarmed townsmen, and printed it, and the picture flew from hand to hand through every colony. It was not a careful record. It was a cry meant to stir the blood, and stir it did. Yet in the midst of that fever, something remarkable happened, a thing worth remembering when you think ill of that age. The soldiers were to be tried, and they needed a lawyer, and few would take so hated a case. It was John Adams, a firm patriot himself, who stepped forward to defend them, believing the law must stand for even the most despised. At the trial, John Adams argued plainly that in a fearful, jostling crowd, no man could be sure who had provoked whom, and that justice must weigh the doubt honestly. The jury listened, and most of the soldiers went free, and the young lawyer's own countrymen, in time, respected him the more for it. Meanwhile, both sides, alarmed by how near the edge they had come, drew quietly back. The Townshend duties were repealed, all but the small tax on tea. The streets grew calm again. But beneath that calm, thin threads were being spun. Committees of correspondence, letter linked to letter, weaving 13 separate quarrels slowly into one shared and lengthening story. Of all the things that might have brought a mighty empire to the very brink of war, it was, in the end, a simple leaf steeped in hot water. Tea. Rest your thoughts a moment on how strange and small that seems, that so gentle a comfort, the drink of quiet afternoons and evening firesides, should become the thing over which an ocean of trouble broke. Yet tea sat at the crossing of so much, of daily habit, of great fortunes far away, and of that one small tax that had been left in place when all the others fell. And around that single leftover tax, the whole argument had quietly coiled itself, waiting. Far across the sea, a giant was in distress. The Great East India Company, that vast trading house whose ships ranged half the world, had fallen into deep financial trouble. Its warehouses in England groaned with tea it could not sell, millions of pounds of it, going stale in the dark while the company's debts climbed and its shares sank. It was, in its way, too large to be let fall, so tangled up was it with the wealth and the pride of the nation. And so the king's ministers put their heads together to find some clever way to rescue it, and their eyes turned, once more toward America. The plan they devised in 1773 was a cunning one, and that was exactly its danger. By a new law, the Tea Act, the company would be allowed to ship its tea straight to the colonies and sell it cheaper even than the smuggled tea the colonists had grown used to. On the surface, it looked like a gift. But hidden inside that bargain, quiet as a hook inside soft bait, lay the small Townsend tax on tea, still to be paid. To buy this cheap and pleasant tea, then, was to pay that tax, and to pay it was to admit, without a word, that Parliament had the right to tax them after all. The colonists, who had by now grown very good at reading between the lines, saw the hook beneath the bait at once. They understood that a low price was being offered as the doorway to a large surrender. Accept the tea and you accepted the principle, and the principle once accepted could never again be denied. So the very cheapness that was meant to tempt them became instead the thing that warned them. Better, they said to one another, to pay more for our tea and keep our liberty, than to save a few pennies and give away the right to govern ourselves. The bargain, so carefully baited, found few takers. Word went out ahead of the tea ships, and port after port made ready to turn them back. In Philadelphia and New York, committees met the vessels and persuaded them, none too gently, to sail home with their cargo untouched. In Charleston, the tea was landed but locked away in damp cellars to rot, sold to no one. Up and down the coast the message was the same: your tea is not wanted here, and it will not be bought. It was a remarkable thing, a whole seaboard of scattered towns, without any single command, arriving at one stubborn answer. The tide of feeling had grown too strong for any ship to land against it. But Boston was Boston, and its royal governor, Thomas Hutchinson, was a proud and stubborn man who had had quite enough of the town's defiance. Where other officials let the tea ships slip quietly away, he swore the tea would land in Boston and the tax would be paid, whatever the people wished. He had his own reasons, some of them tangled with his own family's trade, but chiefly he meant to prove that the king's authority still held. And so, where elsewhere the crisis was gently sidestepped, in Boston it was set upon a collision. Two hard wills now faced each other across the water, and neither meant to yield. 3 ships rode at Griffin's Wharf, the Dartmouth, and after her the Eleanor and the Beaver, their holds heavy with chests of East India tea. By the law, once a ship had come to port, its cargo had to be unloaded and its duty paid within 20 days, or the tea would be seized and landed by force. So a clock began quietly ticking. The townspeople posted guards upon the wharf to see that not one chest came ashore in secret. Week after week the ships sat there, watched and waiting, while messengers rode back and forth and the governor would not relent and the days ran steadily down toward their end. The last of those days was the 16th of December, in the year 1773, a cold, damp night with rain lately fallen. Thousands of townsfolk crowded into the Old South Meeting House, more than the old walls had ever held, packed shoulder to shoulder in the candlelit gloom, their breath fogging in the chill. One final message had gone to the governor, one last plea to let the ships depart with their tea. All that great assembly now waited, hushed and taut, for his answer to come back through the wet dark. And when at last the word arrived, it was the word they had feared. No. The ships would not be allowed to leave. In the crowded hush that followed, Samuel Adams rose to his feet. He was a plain, rumpled man, no great figure to look at, but the room fell silent for him. "This meeting," he said, "can do nothing more to save the country." Simple words, yet in that charged and waiting air, they seemed to fall like a signal long agreed upon. A strange cry went up near the doors, a whoop as of men made ready, and the great throng began to stir and move. Whether Adams meant his words as the sign, or whether the moment simply seized them, the meeting broke, and the crowd poured out into the December night. Down toward the harbor went a band of men, some 80 or more, roughly disguised, faces darkened with soot and coal dust, a few draped in blankets and feathers in rough imitation of Mohawk warriors. It was a thin disguise, fooling no one who looked closely, yet it said something all the same. This was the deed of no single man, but of a people who claimed the land as their own. They moved not in a wild mob, but in an eerie, disciplined quiet, their footsteps and low voices strange in the still streets. Down the dark lanes they went, toward the black water and the waiting ships, tools in hand. At the wharf they split into 3 companies and climbed aboard the 3 ships by the light of lanterns. There was no shouting now, no drunken riot, only steady, purposeful work. They called for the chests to be brought up from the holds, and hoisted them onto the decks, and split them open, and one after another tipped the tea out over the rails into the harbor. 340 chests in all went into the sea that night. The men worked as if at a solemn task, careful and unhurried, and the only sounds were the crack of the chests, the hush of falling leaves, and the lap of the cold tide below. The tide was low, and the tea did not sink but drifted, thick and dark, spreading in great sodden rafts upon the black water around the ships. So much of it came down that some of the men had to climb over the side and tread it under, breaking it up so it would not simply wash back whole. By lantern light, the whole harbor seemed steeped like an enormous pot. And through it all, the discipline held. Nothing was stolen, no private goods were touched, no man filled his own pockets. One who tried to pocket a little tea for himself was quickly made to give it up. This was to be a protest, they meant, and not a theft. When the last chest was emptied and the last leaves floated free, the men did a curious and telling thing. They swept the decks clean. They set the ships back in order, made good the small locks they had broken, and left everything as tidy as they had found it, harming nothing but the tea itself. Then, as quietly as they had come, they climbed down and melted away into the sleeping town, and went home to their beds. Some say a fife played softly as they went. By morning the streets were empty and calm, as if nothing had happened, save for the harbor, still dark with the ruin of an empire's tea. It was a stunning act of defiance, and everyone who heard of it knew so at once. Some 340 chests, a small fortune in tea, deliberately destroyed, not in a drunken frenzy, but coolly, openly, as a message meant to be read across an ocean. The colonists had done more than refuse attacks. They had answered the king's stubbornness with a stubbornness of their own, and there could be no pretending it away. Now the whole of America held its breath and waited. The deed was done and could not be undone. The only question left was how the king, so far away and so newly insulted, would choose to answer. The answer, when it came, was cold and hard and furious. Word of the ruined tea reached London, and there kindled a deep and settled anger, not only at Boston's insolence, but at the destruction of so much lawful property, flung into the sea as though the king's law were nothing. This time there would be no quiet backing down, no repeal to soothe the colonies. Boston must be punished, and punished so plainly that every other town would take the lesson to heart. And so Parliament drew up a set of stern new laws, meant to bring the proud town to its knees, laws the colonists would come to name, with bitter feeling, the intolerable acts. The first and cruelest of them struck at the very life of the place. The port of Boston was ordered shut. No ship might enter or leave the harbor until the town had paid for every last chest of the drowned tea. Now Boston lived by the sea as a body lives by breath. Its wharves, its warehouses, its shipwrights and sailors and merchants all fed by the tides of trade. To close the port was to close a hand slowly around the town's throat. The great harbor fell silent, the wharves stood empty, and men who had always worked found no work. It was meant, quite plainly, to starve a stubborn town into obedience. But the ministers were not done. Another law tore up the old charter of Massachusetts, the treasured frame of its self-government. Officials the people had once chosen were now to be named by the crown instead. Town meetings, that ancient New England habit where farmers and tradesmen gathered to govern their own affairs, were forbidden save by special leave. It was as if a family were told it might no longer speak around its own table. To the colonists this was the deepest wound of all, worse, almost, than the closing of the port. For it said, without disguise, that the liberties they had lived by for generations existed only at another's pleasure, and could be swept away. All of this was meant to set Boston apart, to make of it a lonely example, cut off and cast out, that the other colonies might shrink from its fate and mind their manners. But the plan, so carefully cruel, did the very opposite of what it intended. For the other colonies looked north at what was being done to Boston, and instead of turning away in fear, they felt a cold shudder of recognition. If the king's hand could fall so heavily upon Boston over a matter of tea, then whose town was safe? Whose charter, whose meetings, whose harbor? The punishment meant to divide them became, instead, the thing that began to bind them together. If they can do this to Boston, men said to one another in taverns and doorways from Virginia to New Hampshire, they can do it to any of us, and feeling so, they did not merely grumble, they gave. From the countryside all around and from colonies far to the south, help began to move toward the closed and hungry town. Down the rough roads came wagons heavy with rice from Carolina, with grain and flour, with barrels and provisions of every kind. Flocks of sheep were driven north as gifts. Purses of money were gathered up and sent along. A town shut off from the sea was being quietly fed by a whole continent's outstretched hands. And out of this shared alarm grew a bolder idea, that the colonies ought to sit down together in one place and decide as one what should be done. So in September of 1774, in the pleasant brick city of Philadelphia, there gathered the First Continental Congress. From 12 of the 13 colonies the delegates came, jolting over hundreds of miles of road to meet men they had known before only as names. They filled a modest hall and looked upon one another with curiosity and hope, strangers from distant provinces discovering, a little to their own surprise, how much they shared. It was the first time the scattered colonies had truly spoken with something like a single voice. What a gathering of men it was around those tables. There sat Samuel Adams of Boston, fiery and tireless, who had done so much to bring them all to this pass. Beside such spirits was his careful cousin John Adams, weighing every word, the lawyer's caution steadying the patriot's heat. From Virginia came a tall, quiet planter named George Washington, who spoke little but whom other men watched, sensing in his stillness some deep reserve of strength. And there was Patrick Henry, whose tongue could set a room ablaze, and who rose to say that the old lines were dissolving. "I am not a Virginian," he declared, "but an American." The word hung new and strange and thrilling in the air. For all their differences, and they were many, these men of rice and tobacco and codfish, of grand plantations and crowded ports, they found in the end that they could agree on the thing that mattered. They resolved to stand with Boston and not abandon her to her fate. And they agreed upon a great and sweeping measure, to cut off nearly all trade with Britain, buying almost nothing from her and selling almost nothing to her, until these harsh laws were undone. It was the old weapon of the boycott, but now taken up not by one town or one port, but by 12 colonies acting together as one. Then they parted, agreeing to meet again if the trouble was not mended. While the great men talked in Philadelphia, out across the countryside ordinary people were quietly making ready in a plainer way. On village greens up and down New England, and beyond, the local militia began to drill, farmers and blacksmiths and shopkeepers, shouldering old muskets and falling into rough ranks in the cold. In the frost of early morning they marched and wheeled and learned again the half-forgotten trade of soldiers. These were not paid armies but the neighbors themselves, mustering after the day's work or before it, their breath smoking in the winter air. Something in the times told them that the arguing might not stay arguing forever, and that a farmer might yet be called to fight. Among these citizen soldiers, the towns chose out their swiftest and readiest men and gave them a fitting name, the Minutemen, for they pledged to be armed and ready to march at a single minute's warning. Should the alarm ever come, they meant to be first upon the road, muskets in hand, before slower men had found their boots. And so, all through the winter and into the spring, powder was gathered and hidden, and lead was cast into shot, and muskets long resting above the hearth were cleaned and oiled and made to fire true. Stores of arms were quietly laid up in barns and cellars in the villages round about, against a day that drew nearer than anyone quite wished to say. Far to the south, in the spring of 1775, that same rising spirit found its most famous voice. In a crowded church in Virginia, before an assembly of grave and worried men, Patrick Henry rose once more to speak. He spoke of the danger of waiting too long, of hoping for peace when peace was slipping away, of the chains he believed were already being forged. And then, lifting his voice at the last, he gave the words that would ring down all the years that followed. "Give me liberty," he cried, "or give me death." A hush, and then a stir, ran through the room. He had named aloud the terrible stakes that others had only felt. For that was the truth now laid bare, plainly and without comfort. This was no longer a squabble over the price of tea or the wording of a charter. Men were beginning to speak of liberty as a thing worth dying for, and to reckon soberly with the cost of losing it. On both sides of the ocean there were still many who longed for no such reckoning. Good and loyal people who loved the king, who dreaded war, who prayed each night that some way back might yet be found. Neither side, in its heart, truly wished to fire the first shot. And yet the stakes had been named, and once named, they could not easily be unheard. So the winter turned toward spring, and the land held a strange and watchful stillness. In the fields the frost softened, and the first green showed at the wood's edge, and life went on as life does, but underneath it lay a waiting, taut as a held breath. The powder was stored in the country barns. The Minutemen slept with their muskets near. The king's soldiers kept their watch in occupied Boston, and out beyond the town the militia kept theirs. Everyone felt how near the spark had crept, though no one could say just when or where it would fall. Two people stood facing each other across a narrowing gap, each hoping the other might yet step back. And there, on that trembling edge, we will let the story rest for tonight. Picture the countryside sleeping under a thin spring moon, the villages hushed, the greens where the militia drilled now empty and silvered with dew, the hidden stores of powder waiting in the dark. Somewhere a sentry stamps his feet against the cold. Somewhere a farmer lies awake, listening. All the long quarrels of the years, the stamps, the duties, the soldiers, the tea, the shuttered port, had gathered at last into this single held breath. What came next would change the world. But that is a tale for another quiet night. For now, let yourself grow still and drift and sleep. It is the spring of 1775, and the nights around Boston are still cold enough for a fire. In a fine house in the town, a heavy, tired man named Thomas Gage sits with his candles and his maps. He is a British general, and he governs this restless place for the king, and lately the news that reaches him keeps him from his rest. The rebels, his informers whisper, have been gathering. In a village called Concord, some 18 miles inland over rolling country, They have hidden powder and muskets and cannon in barns and cellars. Gage rubs his eyes and thinks it through. If he could seize those stores quietly, and perhaps catch the ringleaders in their beds, the whole rebellion might sputter out before it ever caught fire. So the general lays his plan with care, meaning to keep it secret. He will send his soldiers out not by daylight but by night, quietly, across the water and along the country roads, so that Concord might be reached and searched before the sleeping farmers ever knew. Yet Boston in those days was a town of watching eyes. It sat almost on an island, joined to the mainland by a slender neck of land, and its narrow streets were full of people who loved the king less than Gage supposed. A regiment cannot polish its boots and draw its rations without someone noticing. Stable boys noticed. Servants noticed. And what they noticed they carried softly to the men who were listening. The patriots had been listening for a long while. They knew that some night the soldiers would move, and they had made ready a plan of quiet cleverness. Across the river, in the countryside, riders waited to carry the alarm. But first those riders had to be told which way the redcoats were coming, whether they would march out over the narrow neck by land or be rowed across the wide black water. And so a signal was agreed, high in the steeple of the Old North Church, the tallest thing in Boston. One lantern hung in the tower would mean the soldiers came by land. 2 lanterns would mean by sea. A small flame to speak across the dark to friends who could not otherwise be reached. And so, late on the 18th of April, the watchers had their answer. The soldiers were gathering at the water's edge to be ferried across. Up in the black spire of the Old North Church, a hand lifted 2 lanterns to the window, 2 small trembling points of gold against the night. They burned only for a minute, hardly longer, for fear of watching eyes below. But a minute was enough. Out in the countryside, men saw the twin flames and understood, by sea, they are coming by sea. The signal had crossed the water. Somewhere a horse was already being saddled, its breath steaming in the cool spring dark, and the long quiet night was about to break open. Then the riders went out. They slipped from the shadows and set their horses to a gallop along the country lanes, and the most famous of them was a silversmith of Boston named Paul Revere. He rode from farmhouse to farmhouse through the sleeping land, and at each dark door he pounded and called out that the regulars were marching. Windows glowed awake behind him. Dogs barked. Men pulled on their coats and reached for the muskets above the hearth. Church bells began to ring across the hills, one village passing the alarm to the next. Revere was not alone. Other riders spread the word down other roads, so that the warning ran faster than any single horse, farm to farm, town to town, all through the short spring night. Dawn came gray and cold to a village called Lexington, and there, on the green common at the heart of the town, some 70 local men had gathered. They called themselves Minutemen, for they had promised to be ready at a minute's notice, and here they stood, farmers and shopkeepers and boys, a few grandfathers among them, their breath hanging in the chill. They were not truly an army. They had come out of their houses in the half-dark, blinking, muskets in hand, unsure of what the morning would bring. And then, up the road, they heard it. The tramp of many boots, the sunrise glinting on a long red column marching toward them out of the mist. The soldiers had come. A British officer rode forward, his voice sharp in the still morning, and shouted at the townsmen to lay down their arms and disperse, to go home, to scatter, to melt away. The Minutemen wavered. Their own captain, seeing how few they were against so many, seems to have told them to stand aside and let the column pass. Some began slowly to move off the green. No one wanted to be the one who started a war. On both sides, hearts were hammering. Fingers rested on triggers. The two lines stood only yards apart in the thin light, breathing, waiting, each afraid of the other. The whole of history balanced for a moment on the edge of that quiet common. And then a shot rang out. To this day, no one knows whose finger pulled that trigger, whether a nervous soldier, a hidden marksman, an accident, a misunderstanding. It hardly mattered. That single crack tore the morning apart, and in an instant the tense silence dissolved into a ragged, frightened volley. The redcoats, keyed up and shouting, fired into the little cluster of townsmen and surged forward with their bayonets. It was over almost before it began. When the smoke drifted off the grass, 8 men of Lexington lay dead on their own village green, and more were wounded, and the survivors had scattered into the fields. The first blood of the long war had soaked into the spring earth. The column reformed and marched on to Concord, still bent on its errand, and there the soldiers spread out to search the town for the hidden stores of powder and arms. But the Patriots had been warned in good time, and much of what the British came for had already been carried off and buried in fields and sunk in ponds. The soldiers found little. They tipped a few barrels, spiked a few cannon, and set a small fire that sent up a thread of smoke over the rooftops. And from the low hills around the town, the militia of the countryside, hundreds of them now, more arriving by the hour, watched that smoke rising and began, grimly, to gather at the river's edge. At Concord's North Bridge, the two sides met again. Across the narrow wooden span, the militiamen came marching down toward the soldiers who held it, and this time the Americans did not scatter. When the redcoats fired, the farmers were ordered to fire back, the first time in all this quarrel that Americans had, by deliberate command, returned the fire of the King's troops. It was a small volley on a small bridge in a small town. Yet a poet, long years afterward, would call it the shot heard round the world, for word of what happened there would travel far beyond that quiet river, and kingdoms would feel it. The soldiers fell back from the bridge, and the day began to turn. Now the long, terrible road home to Boston opened before the British, and it became a road of torment. All along the 18 miles the countryside had risen, and the militia lined the route, not in ranks on an open field, but hidden. Behind every stone wall they crouched, behind barns and trees and the corners of houses. As the red column trudged past, muskets flashed from the hedgerows, and men fell, and the shooters slipped away to fire again from the next wall further on. There was no enemy to charge, no line to break, only the endless snapping fire from either side of the road. The soldiers marched faster, then stumbled, weary and frightened, through a land that seemed itself to be shooting at them. By the time the battered column staggered back within sight of Boston, the day was nearly spent, and the British had lost far more than the handful of stores they had marched out to seize. Hundreds of the king's soldiers had fallen along that dreadful road, killed or wounded or lost, while the farmers who harried them had suffered far fewer. The proud regiment that set out so quietly in the dark came reeling home in disorder, ragged and thirsty and stunned that plain countrymen could do such a thing. And behind them the land would not settle. From every direction the militia kept coming, drawn by the church bells and the riders, until the whole rebellious country seemed to be in motion. The news went out on galloping horses, carried by exhausted riders down every road of New England and beyond. 3 words over and over: blood has been shed. It reached the farms and the seaports and the far southern colonies, and everywhere it fell, men rose. From all across New England the militias marched toward Boston, thousands upon thousands of them, streaming in from every town, and they took up positions around the town on its narrow neck until the whole place was ringed. The greatest army in the world found itself penned into a single seaport, hemmed in by farmers, unable to move without a fight. What had begun as a quiet night march had become, by nightfall, a siege. And yet, remember this, no council had voted for a war. No assembly had risen and solemnly declared it. There had been no grand decision, no line crossed on purpose by any parliament or Congress. It had simply happened the way a spark happens, out of a chill spring morning and a single shot that no one meant to fire, and now here it was, real and bloody and beyond taking back. Thousands of armed men lay in the fields around Boston, and something in the world had shifted. But armed men are not yet an army, and a great and troubling question hung over all their campfires in the dark. Who among them could possibly lead them now? While the militia camped in the fields around Boston, far to the south in Philadelphia, a group of grave men gathered once more in a quiet hall. They were the Second Continental Congress, delegates sent from all 13 colonies, and they had come meaning only to talk and to petition. Now the world had changed under them. Out beyond the horizon, an army of their countrymen stood in arms, and someone had to feed it, and pay it, and lead it, and answer for it. And so, almost without wishing to, this gathering of lawyers and planters and merchants found itself becoming something far heavier than a debating society, a government at war with no country yet to govern. The Congress saw its most pressing need at once. That crowd of men outside Boston must be made into a true army, and a true army needs one commander whom all will follow. But the colonies were jealous of one another. A general from New England might not be trusted in the South, and a Southerner might be resented in the North. They needed a man respected in every colony, steady, dignified, unafraid, a soldier the whole continent could believe in. As they turned the question over in the warm Philadelphia days of that early summer, their eyes kept settling on one delegate in particular, a tall Virginian who sat quietly among them, saying little, and who had taken to wearing, to the meetings, the blue and buff uniform of a soldier. His name was George Washington, and in June of 1775 the Congress chose him to command all their forces. He did not leap at the honor. When they named him, he rose and spoke with grave humility, telling them plainly that he feared he was not equal to so great a charge, that he took it only because his country asked, and that he prayed they would remember he had warned them of his own doubts. And he would take no wages for it, not a penny, asking only that his expenses be repaid. There was something in that quiet, almost fearful acceptance, in that refusal of reward, that made men trust him. A leader who did not hunger for the place seemed the safest kind to give it to. But war does not wait for a general to arrive. Even before Washington could reach the camp, the men outside Boston made their own history. On a June night, the New England soldiers crept up onto the high ground across the water from the town, a hill above a place called Bunker, and there, in the dark, they dug. All night they threw up an earthen wall with picks and spades, working in near silence, and when the sun rose the astonished British saw a fort where the evening before there had been only grass. It was a bold and dangerous thing to plant themselves on that height overlooking the town. The British could not leave it there. They would have to come and take it. So the redcoats came, ferried across the water in the summer heat, and formed up at the foot of the slope in their long, bright ranks. Above them the farmers waited behind their earthen wall, and their powder was terribly short, so short that the order passed quietly down the line, "Hold your fire. Do not waste a single shot. Do not fire," they were told, "until you can see the whites of their eyes." And so they crouched and held, hearts pounding, as the soldiers began to climb. Rank after scarlet rank marching up the open grassy hill in perfect order, drums beating, bayonets shining, closer and closer through the tall summer grass while the men above them said nothing and waited. Then, when the redcoats were dreadfully near, the wall of muskets spoke all at once. A storm of fire tore into the climbing ranks, and the front of the British line seemed to melt into the grass. The proud attack shuddered to a halt and fell back down the slope. They formed again and came again, and again the flame leapt from the earthworks and threw them back. Twice the finest soldiers in the world climbed that hill, and twice they were hurled down it. Only on the third assault, when the farmers had at last fired away nearly all their powder and had nothing left to load, did the wall fall silent, and the redcoats came over it, and the weary defenders gave up the height and slipped away. So the British held the hill at the end of that long, bloody afternoon, and yet it was a victory that tasted like defeat. To take that one low rise, they had lost more than 1,000 men, killed and wounded, an appalling price for a patch of Massachusetts grass. Their commanders were shaken to the bone. And in that dreadful arithmetic lay a truth that no one in London had quite wished to believe. These were not a rabble to be frightened off with a show of red coats and drums. These plain farmers would stand behind their wall against the king's own regiments, and hold, and make the greatest army on earth pay for every step. The war would be long and it would be costly, and it had only just begun. Into this Washington rode to take up his command, and what he found was not an army at all but a great, disorderly crowd. The men were brave enough, they had proved that on the hill. But they had no uniforms, only the homespun clothes they had marched in. They kept little discipline, came and went as they pleased, obeyed the officers they liked and ignored the rest. There was almost no powder in the whole camp, barely enough for a single fight had the British only known it. Sickness spread through the crowded tents. And this was the instrument with which he was to face an empire. His task, he saw, was nothing less than to forge free and stubborn men into soldiers. So began the long, grinding months of the siege. Washington's men and the British sat and stared at one another across the lines that ringed the town, week after week, through the fading of summer and into the cold. There were no great battles now, only the slow, patient work of holding the enemy penned inside Boston while an army was painfully built in the open air. Washington drilled his men and begged the Congress for powder and struggled to keep his shifting ranks from simply wandering home when their terms ran out. It was tedious, thankless work, this waiting in the mud and the frost, and yet somewhere in those quiet months a shapeless crowd was slowly, stubbornly becoming an army. What that army lacked above all was heavy guns, and to fetch them a young Boston bookseller named Henry Knox proposed a thing that sounded like madness. Far away to the northwest, at a captured fort called Ticonderoga on a frozen lake, sat scores of cannon taken from the British. Knox offered to go and bring them back, 300 miles of them over mountains in the dead of winter. And he did it. Through the deep snows of the new year of 1776, he hauled some 60 tons of iron and bronze on great wooden sledges, dragged by oxen, across frozen rivers and over icy passes, coaxing his monstrous cargo mile by mile through the white silence. It was one of the most astonishing feats of the whole war. And so, one quiet morning, the British in Boston looked up to the heights above the town and could not believe their eyes. During the night, without a sound anyone had heeded, Washington's men had swarmed up the high ground and planted Knox's cannon there. Rows of them, dark against the winter sky, their muzzles looking straight down into the town and the harbor where the king's ships lay at anchor. It had been done in a single night, silently, brilliantly. There the guns sat in the pale dawn, saying without a word that Boston was no longer a place the British could safely stay. The whole balance of the siege had turned while the town slept. The British commanders understood their position at a glance. Those guns on the heights could shatter their ships and rake their lines, and to storm the hill would mean another bunker, another slaughter on another open slope. They had no stomach for it. And so, rather than fight, they chose to go. In March of 1776, the great British fleet spread its sails in the harbor and stood out to sea, carrying the army and hundreds of frightened loyal townsfolk away with it, leaving Boston behind. From the heights, the Americans watched the white sails dwindle toward the horizon. The town that had been ringed and besieged for the better part of a year was, at last, free. It was a triumph, and the people came out into the streets to savor it. Washington's ragged army marched into a Boston without a single redcoat in it, and for a golden moment it seemed the tide of the whole struggle had turned their way. In less than a year these farmers had stood at a bridge, held a hill, built an army out of a crowd, and driven the mightiest power on earth out of one of their chief cities. It was a thing to be proud of, and men were right to be proud. Bells rang. Neighbors embraced in the lanes. The long, cold siege was over, and the enemy had sailed away over the gray spring sea. But Washington did not let himself rejoice for long, because Washington understood what the cheering crowds could not yet see. The British had not been beaten. They had merely sailed away, and an empire does not surrender a continent because it loses one town. They would come back. Of that he had no doubt at all, and they would come back greater than before with more ships and more soldiers, and they would strike somewhere new. Even as Boston celebrated, his mind was already turning southward, to the wide harbor of New York, where a free-flowing sea gave the enemy's fleet every advantage. The war was not ending. In truth, its hardest days were only now drawing near. Something was changing slowly in the American mind, so slowly that even those it was changing hardly felt it move. For more than a year now the colonies had been at war, men dying at Lexington and on the hill above Boston, and yet all that while they had still called themselves loyal subjects of the king. They fought, they said, not to leave the empire but to win back their rightful place within it, to make the king see reason and call off his ministers. They spoke of reconciliation, of healing the breach, of the happy day when all would be as it once was. To break away entirely, to become a separate people, that was a thought most of them still shrank from, like a door they dared not open. Then, in the cold heart of the winter of 1776, a small book appeared, and it changed everything. Its writer was an Englishman named Thomas Paine, only lately come to America, a man who had failed at nearly everything he had tried in the old country and found in the new one a voice like a trumpet. His book he called Common Sense, and it was written not for scholars but for ordinary people, in words so plain and blazing and fearless that anyone could feel their force. It cost little, it hid nothing, and it said out loud the thing that many had been afraid even to think. Once read, it could not be unread. A door had been thrown open, and the cold wind of a new idea came rushing through. Paine's argument swept away the whole ancient notion of kings as though brushing dust from a table. Why, he asked, should a great and growing continent, rich in land and people and promise, be forever ruled by a small distant island across 3,000 miles of ocean? It was against all reason, against nature itself, that the larger should be governed by the smaller, the mainland by the speck of rock. And kings themselves, what were they, he asked, but men who had once seized power by force and dressed it up in crowns and ceremonies? To bow to such things was not loyalty but madness. Better by far, he said, to stand up as free men and govern themselves. The words were simple and they struck like lightning. The little book spread across the land like fire through dry grass. It sold in the hundreds of thousands, an astonishing number in that small society, so that hardly a household seemed untouched by it. Where one man could read, he read it aloud to those who could not, in the taverns over the fire, at the family hearth after supper, on the church steps and the tavern porches. Soldiers passed worn copies around the camp. Farmers argued over it across their fences. And everywhere it went, it did the same quiet work, turning loyal subjects who had hoped for reconciliation into people who had begun, at last, to imagine a country entirely their own. What had been unthinkable was becoming, month by month, only common sense. And so, at last, the word was spoken aloud that so many had feared to say: independence. It moved through the colonies like a rising tide. In town meetings and colonial assemblies, plain people gave their voice to it, and one after another the colonies began to instruct the delegates they had sent to Philadelphia. No more petitions, no more waiting on the king's mercy. Let us be free. The great Congress could no longer put the question off. What had once seemed treason and folly had become the plain will of the country, welling up from below, from the farms and the villages and the seaports, until the men in the hall had no choice but to take up the largest and most dangerous question any of them would ever face. The Congress named a small committee to set the thing down in writing, to compose a declaration that would tell the world why a people were breaking free. There were wise and famous men on that committee, but the actual writing they handed to their youngest member, a quiet, red-haired Virginian of 33 named Thomas Jefferson. He was known for saying little in debate, but for a rare gift with a pen, a grace and clarity in his writing that the others admired and trusted. And so, through some 17 days of that Philadelphia summer, he shut himself away alone in a rented room, at a small writing desk by the window, and searched for the words that might speak not only for himself, but for a whole new nation being born. The words he found have never faded. He wrote that certain truths were self-evident, needing no proof, plain to any honest heart, and chief among them, that all men are created equal. He wrote that they are given by their Creator certain rights that can never rightly be taken away, among them life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. And he wrote that governments exist only to secure these rights and draw their just powers from the consent of the governed, that authority flows upward from the people and not downward from any king. Simple lines, written by a young man alone in a summer room, and yet they would echo down the centuries and be spoken by people yearning to be free in lands he never dreamed of. And here, gently, we must pause and be honest, for the truth is tender and hard at once. The man who wrote that all men are created equal held human beings in bondage himself. Enslaved people labored on his lands even as his pen shaped those shining words. And he was not alone in this. Many of the men who would sign that great paper owned other human beings, and the freedom they proclaimed did not yet reach the enslaved among them. It is a deep and painful contradiction, and we do not smooth it away. The promise they wrote down was greater than the men who made it, greater than they could live up to, and the long, unfinished struggle to make it true for everyone was only just beginning, and would cost much for generations still to come. The great question came at last to a vote. On the 2nd day of July in the year 1776, the Congress resolved that these united colonies were, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. The deed itself was done, the break declared. And then, over the next 2 days, they took up Jefferson's declaration line by line, weighing each phrase, striking some passages, softening others, arguing in the summer heat. On the 4th of July they finished and adopted the words and sent them out into the world. In the streets of Philadelphia, an old bell in the State House tower is said to have rung out over the rooftops, and the news went racing outward. A new nation had announced itself to the earth. Then the declaration went out to be read aloud, and everywhere it was read, the people gathered to hear. In town squares and before courthouses and at the head of marching regiments, an officer or a magistrate would unfold the paper and read those ringing words to the upturned faces of the crowd, and when the reading ended a great cheer would rise. Men threw their hats in the air, bonfires were lit, muskets were fired into the summer sky. In the army camps the soldiers listened in their ranks and understood, some for the first time, exactly what they were now fighting for. Not merely their rights as Englishmen, but a country of their own, newly named before all the world. In New York, the joy took a bolder shape. There, in a public place, had long stood a great gilded statue of the king himself, mounted on horseback, shining with gold. When the declaration was read to the crowds, they poured out into the streets and pulled the king down. Ropes were thrown, and the statue came crashing from its pedestal to a great roar. And then they did a thing full of rough poetry. The gilded lead of that royal figure was carried off to be melted down and cast into musket balls, so that the king's own image might be fired back at the king's own soldiers. It was a small act, and a fierce one, and it said plainly that there was no going back. Yet for all the bells and bonfires, the men who signed that paper knew exactly what they were risking. In the eyes of the empire they were now traitors, and the punishment for treason was the gallows, a hanging offense no less. To put one's name to the declaration was to wager one's neck upon it. It is told that Benjamin Franklin, that wise and twinkling old man, made a grim little jest of it as they signed, saying that now, indeed, they must all hang together, or else, most assuredly, they would all hang separately. They laughed, perhaps, but the truth beneath the jest was real. Each man's signature was a rope he tied around his own throat, in hope that together they might yet slip free. For fine words, once written, must now stand against cannon. A declaration is only ink on paper until an army is willing to bleed to make it true, and out beyond the harbor the reckoning was already gathering. Off the coast of New York, through that same summer, the greatest war fleet the New World had ever seen was coming to anchor. Hundreds of ships, their masts like a floating forest, crowded with more soldiers than lived in most American towns. The king had answered the declaration in his own way, sending the full might of the empire to crush the newborn nation in its cradle. The celebration was over. The reckoning had come. And so we leave this chapter with the bells still faintly ringing and the great fleet dark upon the water, at the meeting place of triumph and dread. A people had dared to name themselves free, in words so lovely they would never die, and now they must defend that daring against the mightiest power on earth, with a ragged army, little powder, and less certainty. The bright summer of independence was giving way to a long season of shadow. Ahead lay retreat and hunger, freezing winters and bitter defeats, days when the whole brave cause would seem all but lost. The darkest hours of the war were drawing near. But that, gentle listener, is a story for another night. Rest now. Let the bells fade and sleep. No sooner had the words of the Great Declaration been read aloud in the summer of 1776 than the sea itself seemed to turn against the young country. Off the harbor of New York, sails began to gather, first a few pale shapes on the horizon, then a dozen, then more than you could easily count. Rest your eyes on that water and let the fleet fill it slowly. Hundreds of British ships riding at anchor, their masts standing thick as a winter forest stripped of leaves. It was the largest force the Empire had ever sent across an ocean. Tens of thousands of well-trained soldiers waited aboard, patient and certain of themselves, and among them marched hired German regiments, far from home, come to fight a war that was not their own. Ashore, George Washington gathered what he had, and it was not much beside all that grandeur. Farmers and shopkeepers, boys from the fields, men whose muskets had lately hung above the hearth. On the low green heights of Long Island, in the last week of August, the two armies met. The British professionals did what professionals do. While one force held Washington's attention, another slipped quietly around his flank in the dark and came upon him from behind. By the time the day was ending, the American line had been folded and broken, and the little army stood with its back against the water, the East River wide and cold before it, and no way home but through it. That night was a night to remember gently, for it was the night the war was very nearly lost and quietly was not. Under cover of darkness, in every small boat that could be found, Washington began ferrying his beaten men across the river toward Manhattan. Muffled oars dipped and rose. Whispered orders passed from mouth to mouth. And as dawn threatened to reveal them stranded and helpless, a thick fog rolled in off the water and settled over the whole crossing, soft as a drawn curtain, hiding the boats from British eyes until the very last soldier had slipped away. When the mist lifted at last, the enemy found the shore empty. The army had vanished into the morning like a thing dreamed. Saved, yes, but only to keep retreating. Through the autumn of 1776, the British pressed forward, and Washington gave ground and gave ground again. New York City slipped from his grasp. One fort fell, then another, and with them thousands of prisoners and precious cannon that could not be replaced. There is a particular ache to losing slowly, to marching away from every place you had hoped to hold, and the men felt it in their tired legs and in their thinning ranks. The leaves turned and dropped. The nights grew long and sharp, and the great British machine came on behind them, unhurried, sure that the whole troublesome business would soon be finished for good. So began the long, bitter walk across New Jersey, a retreat that seemed to have no bottom to it. Mile after muddy mile the little army trudged west, and with every mile it grew smaller. Men whose enlistments had ended simply turned for home. Others, cold and hungry and heartsick, slipped away in the night without a word. Guns were left behind in the mud because there were no longer horses enough to pull them. Washington rode among the dwindling column, and it is said he wore the same worn calm on his face whether the news was bad or worse. Behind always came the enemy. Ahead lay only the wide gray Delaware and the winter closing in. When at last the ragged column reached the river and crossed into Pennsylvania, Washington did a wise and simple thing. He gathered up every boat for miles along the bank and carried them to his own side, so that the enemy, arriving, would find no way across. On the far shore the British made their camps and settled in, content to wait for the ice to bridge the river or for spring to make the roads good again. And on this side huddled the remnant of an army, perhaps a few thousand men, barefoot some of them, wrapped in whatever they had, coughing in the cold. If you had walked among their fires that December, you would have wondered how such a shivering handful could be all that stood between liberty and the end of it. These were the darkest days, and there is no gentle way to soften how near the whole cause came to dying. Desertions ran on and on. The enlistments of many soldiers were set to expire with the turning of the year, and once free, most meant to go home. Across the countryside, sensible men shook their heads and quietly gave the rebellion up for lost. Some who had cheered in July now sought British pardons in December. Even brave hearts sank. Yet in the very depth of it, when hope seemed a thing worn thin to nothing, a few words written by firelight were about to be carried from camp to camp, words that would put warmth back into frozen resolve. Among the soldiers that winter traveled a plain man named Thomas Paine, who had a gift for saying great things in words a farmer could feel. By the light of a campfire, some say using a drumhead for a desk, he set down thoughts that opened with a line the whole country would soon know by heart. These are the times that try men's souls. He wrote of the summer soldier and the sunshine patriot, of how the harder the struggle, the more glorious the triumph. When his words were read aloud to the shivering troops, something stirred in the cold ranks. Not a shout, but a steadying, the quiet lifting of chins. What is cheaply won, he told them, we hold too lightly. This was worth the winter. Now Washington did the boldest thing of his life, and he did it because doing nothing was surer death than any risk. Across the river, in the town of Trenton, lay a garrison of those hired German soldiers, the Hessians, comfortable in their winter quarters and expecting no trouble at all in such bitter weather. Washington resolved to cross the Delaware on Christmas night, in the teeth of the season, and fall upon them at first light. Everything was against it: the ice, the cold, the exhausted men, the sheer madness of moving an army over a frozen river in the dark. But he judged, rightly, that the enemy would never dream anyone would try. And so, quietly, the boats were made ready. Christmas night, 1776, and the storm came down hard. Snow and sleet drove sideways across the black water. The Delaware ran thick with jagged ice that groaned and knocked against the boats as sturdy Massachusetts fishermen worked the oars and poles, threading between the floes. Horses were coaxed aboard and cannon, and rank after rank of half-frozen men who stood in open boats with the storm howling around them and said little. It took most of the long night to bring the army across, hours behind the plan. On the far bank they formed up in the darkness, wet through and shuddering, and began a 9-mile march through the blizzard toward the sleeping town, some leaving bloody prints where boots had worn to nothing. Dawn was breaking gray and thick with snow when the Americans came upon Trenton, and the surprise was complete. The Hessians, roused too late from their beds, could not gather themselves against an enemy no one had imagined would come. In little more than an hour it was over, a short, sharp, almost bloodless business, more a swift closing of a net than a battle. Close to 1,000 prisoners were taken, their muskets stacked, their proud banners lowered. Washington's ragged men, who had lost and retreated and lost again for half a year, had suddenly, quietly won. You can feel across the centuries the astonishment of it, the way the impossible thing turned real in the falling snow. He was not finished. When a British force hurried up to trap the small American army days later, Washington slipped away in the night with a soldier's cunning. Leaving his campfires burning brightly to fool the watching enemy, he stole around their flank in the darkness and struck at Princeton in the cold light of early January 1777. Again the redcoats were caught off balance. Again the Americans held the field. 2 blows in 10 days, delivered in the worst of the winter by an army everyone had counted out. Then, wisely, he drew his weary men off to safe hills for the rest of the season, having done far more than anyone thought possible. Measured against the vast battles of that age, Trenton and Princeton were small things. A few hours, a few hundred, a couple of quiet country towns. But their meaning was enormous, out of all proportion to their size. They proved that the cause still lived, that the amateur army could beat the professional, that the war was not lost after all. Word of the victories ran through the 13 colonies like a warm current threading cold water, and where hearts had sunk, they rose again. Men who had thought of going home stayed. New recruits came in. The revolution, which had lain a breath away from the grave, had been reached down and drawn gently back into the land of the living. As the year 1777 opened, the men who governed Britain bent over their maps and settled on a grand and confident plan. Look with them at the long blue thread of the Hudson River, running from Canada in the north down to the sea at New York. If a great army could march down that valley from the north, and another push up to meet it, the rebellious colonies would be cut clean into New England, the hot heart of the trouble, severed from all the rest. Divide them so, the reasoning went, and each half might be beaten at leisure. It was a bold idea, drawn neatly on paper, and paper is a patient thing that never feels the wilderness. To lead the Northern Army came General John Burgoyne, a man of style and spirit, fond of fine living and fonder still of his own certainty. Gentleman Johnny, His soldiers called him, half in affection. Down from Canada he came in the early summer, his column winding through the green north country with an air almost of a grand progress. And his baggage train tells you the man, cart after cart heavy with fine wine and silver plate and comforts fit for a country house, for Burgoyne did not mean to rough it. He expected a swift, glorious campaign and a warm welcome at its end. The forest ahead of him kept its own counsel and said nothing. At first all went as sweetly as he could have wished. Fort Ticonderoga, the great stone guardian of the lakes that both sides had bled for before, fell into his hands almost without a shot when the Americans, judging it hopeless, slipped away in the night. The news delighted London and dismayed the patriots, and Burgoyne pressed on southward in the highest of spirits, sure the rest would go the same way. But a fort taken is one thing, and 100 miles of hostile wilderness is quite another. Behind his confidence, the map was about to become a forest, and the forest was about to become a trap. For now the country itself rose up to swallow the Grand Army whole. As the Americans fell back, they did not simply run, they ruined the road behind them with cool, deliberate care. Great trees were felled across every trail, their trunks laid crosswise in tangled walls. Bridges were broken and burned. Streams were dammed to flood the low ground into swamp, and the fields were stripped of anything that might feed a horse or a man. Burgoyne's proud column slowed to a crawl, then to a creep, his axemen sweating out whole days to clear a single mile. And with every foot he gained, the long thin line back to his supplies stretched tighter, hundreds of miles from home. Meanwhile, the woods on either side came alive with quiet enemies. This was New England and its borders, a land thick with farms and stubborn, self-governing men, and the sight of a foreign army tramping through their valleys woke something fierce in them. From every direction the militia rose, not in great uniformed ranks, but in twos and dozens and hundreds, farmers with hunting muskets who knew each rock and thicket. They gathered on Burgoyne's flanks like a slow tightening. When he sent a strong column off toward Bennington to seize horses and stores, the country folk fell upon it in the hills and cut it to pieces, and hundreds of his soldiers never came back. His army was shrinking, and it had not yet fought its real battle. That battle waited in the wooded hills above the Hudson, near a place called Saratoga, in the golden turning of the autumn. Twice the armies came together among the trees and the ravines, in fighting close and stubborn and hard. The American lines, thick now with militia and steadied by tough continental regiments, would not break. Burgoyne threw his weary men forward and saw them thrown back bloodied. The ring of riflemen and farmers only drew closer around him. There is no need to dwell on the sharpness of those hours. Let it be enough to say that when the smoke thinned over the hills, it was the great British Army, not the Americans, that had been broken and pressed back upon itself. And now the trap that the wilderness had shaped closed fully. Burgoyne found himself surrounded, the militia thick behind him, his road home a ruin, his food running low, his fine wine long since drunk. He waited for rescue, and no rescue came. The other armies that were to have marched to meet him had never come north. There was nothing left to spend and no way out to spend it on. In October of 1777, Gentleman Johnny did the only thing a soldier could do and surrendered his whole army, nearly 6,000 men, into American hands. His troops laid down their arms in the cool autumn air while the country people watched, hardly believing their own eyes. Hold that moment a while, because it changed everything. An entire British army, one of the finest sent across the sea, had marched into the American woods and simply not marched out. It was a staggering, complete victory, whole and total in a way nothing before had been. Not a raid, not a clever escape, but the capture of an army. The news of it went out from the Hudson Valley on the fastest horses and the swiftest ships, and it crossed the ocean carrying a message the whole world would read. The Americans could not merely resist the empire, they could beat it and beat it utterly. Now let your thoughts travel across the Atlantic to Paris, to the warm candlelit salons of France, where an old American in a plain brown coat had been waiting with great patience for exactly such news. Benjamin Franklin, printer, philosopher, and now his country's envoy, had made himself the delight of all France. He wore a simple fur cap over his thinning hair and small spectacles on his nose, and against the powdered wigs and silk of the French court, he seemed the very picture of honest, homespun wisdom. Ladies adored him. Philosophers quoted him. The whole city took him to its heart. And through all the charm, he watched and waited, knowing France would only gamble on a winner. France had never forgotten her defeat by Britain years before, nor lost her hunger to see her old rival humbled. But she was cautious. She would not spend her treasure backing a losing cause. What she needed was proof that the Americans could truly stand and win, and Saratoga was that proof, laid gleaming on the table at last. When word of the surrender reached Paris, the doors that Franklin had knocked at so patiently swung open. In 1778, France signed a formal alliance with the young United States, pledging not merely sympathy but her powerful navy, her armies, her money, and her vast resources to the American side. What had been a lonely struggle now had a great and wealthy friend. And where France stepped, others followed. Spain, with her own quarrels against Britain, soon entered the war. The Dutch were drawn in as well. What had begun as a family argument between London and 13 colonies on a far shore had swelled and spread until it became something far larger. A war fought not only in the American woods but across the wide oceans of the world, from the Caribbean to the coast of India, wherever the great powers had ships and interests to defend. The colonial quarrel had grown into a world war, and Britain now stood not against a ragged rebel army alone, but against a coalition of her strongest rivals at once. This changed the whole shape of Britain's burden in ways hard to overstate. No longer could she pour her full strength into America, for now she had to guard her possessions all around the globe and, above all, to fear the French fleet upon the sea. Every British soldier and ship had to be weighed against a dozen dangers far from the Hudson. The empire that had seemed so overwhelming off the shore of New York was suddenly stretched thin across half the world, looking over its shoulder in every ocean. For the exhausted Americans, this meant the pressure that had so nearly crushed them would now be shared out and eased. So Saratoga stands as the true turning point of the whole long war. Not the largest battle, perhaps, but the hinge on which everything swung. Before it, the Americans fought alone and mostly lost. After it, they fought with the wealth and might of France beside them, and the future opened up wide. A great door of hope, long shut, had swung slowly open, and through it came the promise that this struggle might actually be won. Word ran through the tired camps and the anxious towns, and men who had endured so much let themselves believe, at last, in the ending they had hardly dared to imagine. And yet, and here we must be honest, as any true story is honest, the door of hope did not mean the road grew easy. Alliances are signed on paper long before their help arrives in the flesh, and a French fleet promised in Paris is not the same as bread in a hungry soldier's hand. Between the triumph of Saratoga and the days when foreign help would truly turn the scales, there lay a hard stretch of country the army still had to cross. The very winter after this great victory would prove one of the cruelest the soldiers ever knew. So let hope shine here, gently, as it deserves, but know that the coldest nights were waiting still. It is one of the strange truths of that year that even as the Northern Army was winning its great victory at Saratoga, Washington himself, far to the south, was tasting defeat. Guarding the young capital at Philadelphia, he met the main British army and was beaten. First in the misty fields along Brandywine Creek, where once again a British flanking march turned his line, and then in a fog-blinded fight at Germantown, where a bold American attack tangled itself in the mist and slipped away. For all his courage, he could not hold the enemy back, and in the autumn of 1777 the British marched into Philadelphia and made themselves at home in the rebel capital. While the redcoats settled into the comforts of the city for the winter warm hearths, full tables, music and card games in fine parlors, Washington led his weary, unbeaten army away to a very different place. Some 18 miles off, on a cold plateau above the Schuylkill River, stood a spot called Valley Forge, a bleak stretch of bare hills and leafless woods, with little to recommend it but that it could be defended and it watched the roads to the city. There the army halted as December closed in, and there it would stay through the whole long, hard winter. No comfort waited for them, only the ground, the cold, and each other. The winter that followed has passed almost into something sacred in the memory of the country, a name spoken softly. With their own hands, the soldiers built rough little huts of notched logs, chinked with mud, crowded a dozen men to each, and these were all the shelter they had against a cold that bit to the bone. Clothing had worn to rags, coats were patched with patches, and blankets were too few to go around. Worst of all, many men had no shoes at all, and wrapped their bare feet in scraps of cloth or hide, or simply went without. Rest here a moment with those small firelit huts scattered on the frozen hill, and feel how thin a wall they made against the season. The deepest wound of that winter was hunger, and it came not from a barren land but from a broken system. The country around was rich enough. Full barns stood within a hard day's ride, but the tangle of getting food to the army had collapsed. Wagons could not be found, or roads were bad, or the money would not stretch, and so provisions that existed never came. For days at a time the men had almost nothing. A little flour baked on a stone, a few boiled scraps, sometimes only water and the gnawing want. Soldiers who could still march left bloody prints in the snow from their bare and broken feet as they went for firewood or stood their turn at guard. And so it was cold and hunger and sickness, not British bullets, that did the real killing at Valley Forge. In the closed, smoky huts, disease spread among bodies worn down by want, fevers and coughs and the wasting sicknesses that prey on the weak and the crowded. Men who had faced cannon without flinching slipped away quietly on their pallets, not in the roar of battle but in the gray silence of a winter morning. Thousands died that season, and hardly a musket was fired to do it. It is a hard thing to hold in the mind, this quiet dying, and we will not linger on the suffering of it. Only remember gently the price these nameless men paid simply by staying. The true wonder of Valley Forge is not that men suffered there. Men have suffered in every war, but that the army did not simply come apart and disappear. By every cold reckoning it should have. Unpaid, unfed, unshod, free to go once winter loosened them, with the cause looking grim and home so near. What held them? A lesser army would have melted away into the countryside and left the revolution to die on that frozen hill. Yet morning after bitter morning the ragged ranks were still there, the huts still smoking, the flag still up. Something kept them, something stronger than comfort or even than reason, and it is worth pausing to ask what that something was. Much of the answer was one man, and he was there among them the whole time. Washington did not retire to a warm house and leave his soldiers to their fate. He stayed, sharing the cold and the short rations and the long, anxious nights. He wrote letter after urgent letter to a distant Congress, pleading, warning, all but begging for food and clothing and pay for men who deserved so much more than they got. When despair crept through the camp, his steady, unbending presence was a kind of anchor. He held that army together, through the worst of it, very nearly by the sheer force of his own will, and the men, watching him endure beside them, found reason to endure too. Into this grim camp, that hard winter, came an unlikely gift from across the sea. A stout, warm-hearted Prussian who called himself Baron von Steuben, an old soldier trained in the finest army in Europe. He spoke almost no English, and when the drills went wrong he would curse grandly in German and broken French, roaring and laughing by turns, until his aides translated the curses for the amused and freezing men. But under the bluster was a master of his craft, and he had come to give the Americans the one thing their courage lacked, the hard, patient discipline that turns brave men into an army that can win. Day after day on the frozen parade ground, von Steuben drilled the ragged farmers and shopkeepers as they had never been drilled before. He taught them to march in step and to wheel in ranks without falling into confusion, to load and fire together, to stand shoulder to shoulder and hold their line when the enemy came on. He showed them the use of the bayonet, which they had scarcely known before. He began with a picked handful, trained them himself, and set them to train the rest, until the whole camp moved to a new and steadier rhythm. Slowly, out on the cold field, a disorderly crowd of willing men was being forged into something that could truly stand and fight. There was tenderness in that hard winter, too. Martha Washington, the general's wife, left the comforts of home and made the long, cold journey north to spend the worst of the season at her husband's side, as she did winter after winter through the war. In her plain dress, she moved among the huts, sitting with the sick and the dying, knitting and mending, bringing what small comforts she could and a gentler presence than the camp had otherwise known. She was not alone in it. Other wives came too, cooking, washing, nursing. Amid so much suffering, these quiet women wove a thread of home through the frozen camp, and the soldiers loved them for it. But when the whole winter is told, the real heroes of Valley Forge are the men whose names no history remembers, the ordinary soldiers who simply stayed. There were no great deeds to do on that hill, no glory to win, only cold and hunger and drill and the slow gray passing of the days. To endure that freely when going home was easy and staying was hard, and to endure it not once but through the whole long season, was a kind of quiet courage as fine as any shown in battle. They kept faith when faith cost the most. Whatever the revolution became, it stood upon the frozen ground where these forgotten men chose, morning after morning, to remain. And then, at last, the snow began to soften and shrink, and the streams to run, and the pale green of spring crept back over the hills. Out of Valley Forge marched a very different army from the one that had staggered in. Leaner it was, and harder and prouder, fewer but forged. The drilling had given it a spine. The suffering, shared and survived together, had given it a soul. These were no longer a hopeful crowd of amateurs but a true fighting force, tempered in the cold like steel drawn from the fire and plunged into water. The men who marched out that spring of 1778 carried themselves like soldiers and knew themselves at last to be an army. The proof came soon enough on a blazing June day near Monmouth, when this new-made army caught the British on the march and would not be brushed aside. Through fearful heat, the ragged Continentals stood and traded blow for blow with the finest regiments of the empire, holding their lines the way von Steuben had taught them, giving no more ground than they must. When the long day ended, they had held the field, matched the redcoats and matched them well. The winter had made them, and Monmouth showed it. Yet even as this triumph settled, the war itself was turning southward, toward hot new ground and hard new trials, where the last great struggle waited to begin. By the winter of 1778, the war in the north had settled into a kind of weary deadlock, two tired armies watching each other across the same worn ground. And so the men who guided Britain's cause turned their eyes far to the south, toward the warm pine woods of Georgia and the Carolinas. There, they believed, lay a great sleeping strength, thousands upon thousands of loyal subjects, quiet neighbors who still loved their king and needed only the sight of red coats among them to rise. Bring the army south, the reasoning went, and a loyal countryside would do half the work. It was a comfortable idea, and like many comfortable ideas, it would prove far harder in the living than in the imagining. It began well enough for them. In the closing days of 1778, a British force came ashore near Savannah, that low and lovely port where the river slides brown and slow toward the sea, and took the town almost before its defenders knew the danger. Georgia, the youngest and smallest of the 13, seemed to fall back beneath the crown like a candle guttering out. Loyal men came forward. A royal governor sat again in his chair. To the mapmakers in London, it looked like the first neat stitch in mending the whole torn fabric of empire. The Southern strategy, that winter, wore the bright and confident face of success. Then came the spring of 1780, and the great blow fell upon Charleston. It was the loveliest city in America, a place of soft sea air and tall shaded houses, and General Clinton brought his whole strength against it by land and by water, drawing his lines slowly tighter week by week. The American General Benjamin Lincoln, hemmed in on his narrow peninsula, held on far too long, hoping for a rescue that never came. In May the city surrendered, and with it an entire American army laid down its arms. Thousands of soldiers marched away into captivity. It was the worst single defeat the young cause would ever suffer, a whole army swallowed at a stroke. And still it grew worse before it grew better. That summer, near a country crossroads called Camden, a second American army came apart. It was led by Horatio Gates, the man history remembered for Saratoga, but here fortune turned her back on him. His soldiers were hungry, many of them untried, sickened by bad rations on the eve of battle, and when Cornwallis struck them in the dim light of an August dawn, much of the line simply broke and fled through the pines. Gates himself was carried far away in the rout. Two armies lost in a single season. To any watching eye, the Carolinas now lay open, and the British seemed to sweep across them like a tide across flat sand. Yet the easy conquest, so gleaming at first, soon began to turn to ashes in their hands. For the South did not lie down quietly beneath the boot. Instead it smoldered, and then it burned, not in the clean lines of drilled armies, but in a slow and bitter civil war of neighbor against neighbor. Here a patriot family, there a loyal one, had lived side by side for years along the same red clay roads, and now old grudges and new fears turned them upon one another. It was the cruelest kind of fighting, close and personal, where the enemy might be the man who once shared your plow. Through those long months, the backcountry knew little mercy. Riders came in the night to barns and farmhouses. There were ambushes at fords and burnings at crossroads, and each raid seemed to summon its answer in kind. Loyalist bands and patriot bands harried one another through the swamps and the tall grass, and the ordinary folk who only wished to bring in a harvest found their fences down and their smokehouses empty. It was a country learning, to its sorrow, that a war among neighbors leaves the deepest and slowest healing wounds of all. The soft southern land, so green and generous, had become a place where trust itself had gone into hiding. But out of that same wild country rose men who would not be beaten. From the Blackwater swamps and the lonely pine barrens came the partisans, hard, patient fighters who knew every hidden creek and half-drowned trail. Chief among them was a lean and quiet Carolinian named Francis Marion, whom the frustrated British came to call the Swamp Fox. He would appear where no one expected him, fall upon a supply train or a sleeping post, and then vanish back into the marshes before the redcoats could form a line. Catch him they never could. He was less an army than a rumor with a rifle, and rumors, they were learning, are very hard to defeat. Meanwhile, far away, Congress reached at last for its finest soldier after Washington himself. His name was Nathaniel Greene, a Quaker from Rhode Island who had taught himself the whole art of war from books read late by candlelight, a limping, thoughtful man with a merchant's steady patience. Washington trusted him above all others, and now sent him south to gather up the broken pieces. Greene came with no grand army, no certain victory in his pocket, only a clear and unglamorous idea of what the moment required. He would not throw his little force away in some brave and hopeless stand. He would keep it alive and let the vast, hostile land do its slow work. For Greene understood a truth that his enemy did not. He did not need to win battles. He needed only to remain. We fight, get beaten, rise, and fight again, he wrote, and in that plain sentence lay the whole shape of his campaign. Let the British win the field if they must. Every march wore down their shoes. Every mile stretched their supplies thinner. Every skirmish cost them men they could not replace on that far shore. An army that cannot be destroyed cannot truly be defeated, and Greene meant to be, above all else, an army that endured. It was a general's kind of patience, quiet and unbending, and it would prove worth more than any single triumph. So began one of the strangest chases of the whole long war. Greene divided his small force, tempted Cornwallis after him, and then led the great British general on a weary, footsore march clear across the Carolinas. Over swollen rivers and through cold winter rains they went, Cornwallis always a step behind, always drawn a little farther from the coast and his ships and his safe supplies. Even when Greene stood and gave battle and lost, he made the British pay so dearly for their victory that it cost them more than defeat would have. Cornwallis won his fields and bled upon them, and each hollow triumph left him weaker and farther from the sea. And here, in the shadow of these hard campaigns, falls the war's most sorrowful betrayal. Benedict Arnold had once been among the brightest of the patriots, the daring, wounded hero of Saratoga, a man of fierce courage whom Washington had loved. But he was proud, and he was deep in debt, and he had nursed a bitter belief that the country had never honored him as he deserved. Slowly the bitterness hardened into treason. In secret he sold himself to the British and agreed, for money and a commission, to hand over the great fortress at West Point that guarded the Hudson's mighty bend. The plot came undone at the very edge of success. A British officer carrying the secret papers was stopped by chance on a country road, and the whole dark design lay suddenly bare. Arnold, warned just in time, fled downriver to the enemy and escaped, but his name did not escape with him. From that day it became a byword, a single word that meant traitor, spoken with a shiver for generations after. That the bravest of soldiers could fall so far troubled the young nation deeply, and made it prize all the more the plain, unwavering loyalty of the quieter men who simply stayed and endured. Through all of it, remember, the heaviest weight fell not on generals but on the ordinary farm families of the South. Theirs were the fields stripped bare by passing armies. Theirs the horses led away, the corn seized, the split rail fences torn up for a soldier's fire. A mother might watch from the tree line as her home went up in smoke against the evening sky, gather her children, and begin again with nothing. These were the truly forgotten soldiers of the war, who never marched in any line, yet paid in full. Their quiet, stubborn refusal to yield was, in the end, the ground on which the whole cause stood. By the autumn of 1781, all of Greene's slow patience had done its work. Cornwallis found himself worn thin, his army hollowed out by the endless marching, far from the ships that were his only true strength. Rather than chase the untakeable Greene through the Carolinas forever, he made a fateful choice. He turned north, into the tobacco country of Virginia, seeking a fresh field and a safe harbor. There, near where the York River meets the wide Chesapeake, sat a small and sleepy tobacco port, its wharves and warehouses drowsing in the warm river light. Its name was Yorktown. And toward Yorktown, though he could not yet know it, the whole great weight of the war was quietly beginning to converge. Far away to the north, before the walls of New York, George Washington had waited years for a moment such as this. He had dreamed of a stroke that might end the war at a blow, and now word came that Cornwallis had settled himself at Yorktown, his back to a river, his hope resting entirely on the sea. Washington saw it at once, the way a patient man sees the one card he has been waiting for. He gathered himself, and then he moved, with a speed that would astonish everyone, friend and foe alike. The long waiting was over. The time to strike had come at last. First came the art of deception. To keep the British in New York from guessing his purpose, Washington left just enough men before their lines to seem an army still, campfires burning, ovens built as if for a long siege, false letters allowed to fall into the wrong hands. And behind that curtain of illusion, he slipped away south with the true heart of his force. Beside him marched a splendid French army under the Count de Rochambeau, allies grown at last into brothers in arms. Down through New Jersey they went, day after hard day, dust-caked and sun-worn, driving for distant Virginia while the British still watched an army that was no longer there. Yet every step of this bold march depended, in the end, upon the sea. Cornwallis at Yorktown was only a prisoner if the ocean at his back could be closed to him. So long as British ships could reach him, he could be supplied or reinforced or simply carried away to fight another day. The whole grand design, all those thousands of marching feet, hung upon a question no soldier on land could answer. Who would command the water where the York River meets the Chesapeake Bay? Washington had done all a general could do. Now he could only march and hope and trust that far out on the blue horizon, fortune was gathering in his favor. And in those very weeks, fortune was. Up from the warm Caribbean came a powerful French fleet under the Admiral de Grasse, its tall sails crowding the southern sea, driving north for the Chesapeake with all the timing of a story too neat to be true. It reached the Great Bay just when it was needed most, and dropped anchor squarely across the mouth of the trap. For once, and at the one moment that mattered above all others, a great fleet stood exactly where the cause required it. The sea, which had so long served the Empire, had turned. Somewhere aboard those French decks lay the hinge on which the whole war would swing. The British Navy came, as it had to break the blockade and free their trapped general. Off the Capes of Virginia the two fleets met, and through a long afternoon they fought their slow, thunderous duel upon the swell, great wooden walls trading fire across the gray water. When it was over, the British squadron, battered and outmaneuvered, drew off and sailed away to refit, leaving the bay in French hands. There would be no rescue by water. Out on the wide Atlantic the ships dwindled and were gone, and with them went Cornwallis's last true hope, carried quietly over the edge of the world. So the door swung shut and softly latched. Cornwallis at Yorktown was sealed in now by land and by water both, the French fleet riding across his one road to the sea, the Allied armies gathering fast at his gates. The mighty British Navy, the pride and shield of the Empire, ruler of half the world's oceans, could not for once reach out its hand to save him. It is a strange and quiet thing, that hush of a closing trap. No single loud moment, only the slow certainty settling in that the way out is gone. Yorktown had become, without a wall being breached, a cage. Then the great armies came together and drew their arc of siege. From the north marched Washington's Continentals and Rochambeau's white-coated French, joining the forces already in Virginia until some 17,000 men encircled the town. Within their tightening ring, Cornwallis held barely 8,000. Slowly the besiegers bent their long lines about the little port like arms folding closed, cutting the roads, seizing the high ground, settling in with the grim patience of men who know that time is now their ally. There was no wild rush, only the sure and deliberate closing of an overwhelming grip. The siege of Yorktown had begun, and its ending was already faintly written. A siege is slow, methodical work, more spade work than swordplay. Night after night the men crept forward under cover of darkness, digging their trenches, their parallels the engineers called them, ever closer to the enemy's earthworks, throwing up walls of soil and gabions to shield the guns they would bring up next. And then, when the lines were near enough, the great bombardment opened. Scores of cannon and mortars began to thunder together, and the shells rose in long fiery arcs across the night sky, curving like slow-falling stars above the dark and huddled town. From a distance it had a terrible beauty, that rain of light, though within the works it was a fearful thing indeed. Two forward strongpoints stood in the way of the final lines, a pair of stubborn earthen redoubts that had to be taken before the trenches could close the last few yards. And so, on a dark October night, they were stormed by hand, with the bayonet alone, muskets unloaded so that no chance shot might rouse the alarm too soon. One redoubt fell to the French, the other to a column of Americans led by a young officer of quick brilliance and burning ambition, Alexander Hamilton, who went over the parapet at the head of his men. In a few sharp, breathless minutes the works were carried, and the last ring drew tight around the town. Now Cornwallis's position was past all mending. His earthworks were crumbling under the ceaseless guns, his men worn and hungry, his hope nearly out. In one last desperate gamble he tried to slip his army across the York River by night, to break out on the far shore and run, but the sky itself seemed set against him. A sudden squall came howling down the river, scattering his boats upon the black water and driving them back, and the escape dissolved into wind and rain. There was nothing left to try. He had reached, at long last, the plain and final end of all his choices, with the storm laughing at his heels. And so, on the morning of the 17th of October, 1781, a lone drummer boy climbed the shattered parapet and began to beat the slow, unmistakable roll that means a parley. Beside him a British officer raised a white handkerchief, small and bright against the smoke-stained sky. For a moment the great guns fell silent, and across the torn ground the meaning traveled from man to man. The enemy wished to talk of terms. That single soft roll of a drum, that one waving square of white cloth, did more than any cannon that day. It was the sound of an empire, at this one place, admitting that it could go no further. 2 days later, the surrender came. Out from the ruined town marched the British Army, slow and solemn, between two long lines that stretched away down the road. The Americans on one side in their worn and mended blue, the French on the other in their spotless white. It is said the British bands played an old and homely tune as they came, a song called "The World Turned Upside Down," and if they did, no melody could have suited the hour better. For that was precisely what had happened. A ragged, doubted, half-clothed rebellion had brought one of the proudest armies on earth to lay down its colors in a Virginia field. The meaning of it rolled outward like a great slow wave. Here at Yorktown, a rebel force that London had so often dismissed as a rabble had trapped and beaten a full imperial army, in the open before all the world. Word crossed the ocean by ship, as all word did then, and reached the capital of the empire weeks later. When Lord North, the king's chief minister, heard the news, they say he paced his rooms in stricken disbelief and cried out again and again, "Oh God, it is all over." He had felt, in that moment, the ground of an age shifting quietly beneath his feet. And in a sense he was right, though the last formalities lay 2 years further on. The great question, so long in doubt, had been answered at Yorktown. The war's true heart had stopped there in the October mud. There would still be talking and treating, ships and signatures before the thing was fully done, but the outcome was no longer in question. America would be free. That knowledge spread slowly through the 13 weary states like warmth returning to cold hands, and men who had marched and starved and buried friends for 6 long years began, at last, to let themselves believe that it had not been in vain. It takes time for so great a thing to become real. A victory in a field is one moment. The slow untangling of a war between nations is another, and it does not hurry. Across the ocean, the government that had waged the long fight could not survive the loss of Yorktown, and it fell. In its place sat a weary new ministry, men who wanted only to be done with a war that had cost so much and won so little, and who took up their pens to make a peace. And so, as it so often does, the great argument of armies passed quietly into the patient hands of diplomats. To speak for the young United States came three uncommon men. There was old Benjamin Franklin, wisest and most beloved of Americans abroad, with his shrewd eyes and his gentle, unhurried wit. There was blunt, upright John Adams, who never learned to flatter and never wished to, and there was the careful lawyer John Jay, watchful of every clause. Together, in the drawing rooms of Paris, they matched their plain colonial sense against the polished diplomats of the old world, playing the great powers gently one against another, and asking always for more than anyone thought they might dare. They were farmers and tradesmen's sons, and they held their own among kings. Their long labor bore fruit at last in the Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783. In its measured phrases, Great Britain acknowledged what had once seemed unthinkable, that the United States of America were free, sovereign, and independent, a nation among the nations of the earth. And the new country's borders were drawn not along some narrow strip of coast, but westward over mountains and forests, all the way to the great Mississippi River. It was a vast inheritance for so young a people. On paper, in careful ink, the 13 quarreling colonies had become a country, and the long dream of the village greens had been written into the law of the world. Then came a scene worth holding in the mind. In the closing weeks of 1783, the last British ships weighed anchor and stood out of New York Harbor, their sails filling one final time as they turned for the open sea and home. And down the streets of the freed city rode George Washington, come to take possession of the place where the war had so nearly been lost at its very beginning. The crowds pressed close along his way, and many wept openly to see him, not for sorrow now, but for the sheer unbelieved joy of it, the general returning to a city that was, at last and truly, their own. And now Washington did the simplest and rarest thing of all, the thing that made the whole world marvel. He gave up his power. He had commanded the armies for 8 long years. He might, had he wished it, have kept his sword and let grateful soldiers make him a king. Instead, he gathered his officers in a quiet room to bid them farewell, and could hardly speak for the tears. And then, before the Congress, he formally resigned his commission and laid down his command. He handed back the very authority that had been given him, and turned, an ordinary citizen once more, toward the long road home. That home was Mount Vernon, his farm above the Potomac, where he wished for nothing grander than to walk his own fields again and watch his own trees leaf out in spring. And far across the sea, his old adversary King George III heard what the American general had done, that he had won a war and then simply given the power back. The king could scarcely credit it. If Washington truly meant to lay it all down and go home to his plow, said George, then he would be the greatest man in the world. In that quiet act lay the deepest root of the new republic. Here it was declared without a word, no man would be king. Yet winning independence, they soon found, is not the same as building a nation. The 13 states had bound themselves together only loosely, each jealous of its own, and the weak league they had made began to drift and fray. Debts went unpaid and quarrels went unsettled. The young country wobbled like a cart with a cracked wheel. And so, in the warm summer of 1787, the finest minds of the age gathered once more in Philadelphia, Washington himself presiding in grave silence, aged Franklin lending the room his calm and seasoned wisdom, to try to fashion a government worthy of a free people, one strong enough to hold together, yet never so strong as to crush the very liberty it was meant to guard. What they made was a careful thing of balanced parts, powers set gently against powers so that none might grow into a tyrant, a frame built by men who had just fought a king and meant never to raise another. And they began the whole with 3 plain and revolutionary words: "We the people, not we the rulers, not we the wealthy, not we the mighty, but the people themselves, claiming the government as their own creation and their own servant." It was a bold and almost unheard of thing to write down. In those 3 small words lay the seed of everything the nation would later strive and struggle and slowly grow to become. And yet honesty asks us to remember, gently, what that bright promise did not yet reach. For all the ringing words of liberty, 1,000,000 men, women, and children still lived and labored in bondage. The native peoples were being pushed westward from the lands of their fathers, and to women the new order granted little share in its freedoms. The promise those founders wrote was far grander than the world that made it, a light held higher than the hands that raised it. But a promise once written down does not sleep forever. It became a seed that later generations would return to and hold up and demand at last be honored in full. For in the end, what those tired farmers on the village green began was not a finished and perfect nation. It was something braver and less certain than that, a bold, unfinished idea set loose in the world to be worked out slowly across the centuries. The idea that a people might govern themselves, that ordinary men and women could hold their own fate in their own hands, and answer to no crown but their own conscience. They handed that idea forward, imperfect and unfinished, trusting those who came after to carry it further than they could. And so it has been carried, hand to hand, down all the long years since, and rests now quietly with us. The muskets are long silent now. The campfires that once dotted the dark hills have burned down to gray embers and gone cold, and all of them, everyone who marched and hoped through those hard years, are long since gone to their rest. Washington himself sleeps beneath the trees at Mount Vernon, above the river he loved, where the quiet water still slides gently by. The great noise of it all has faded into stillness, into the soft hush of a story finished. There is nothing loud left in it now. Only the calm that comes at the end of a very long day, when the work is truly done. So let them rest, then, as you are resting now, the farmers and the printers, the generals and the drummer boys, and all the countless nameless ones whose names no book remembers. Their long day's work is over. Let them sleep, And so may you. Let the old story settle over you like a lamp burning low in a dark and peaceful room. Its small light steady, its warmth enough. There is nothing left to do tonight. There is nowhere at all you must be. A soft farewell, then breathe slowly and let go of the day and drift gently down into sleep. When you wake, another story and another quiet light will be waiting. Good night. Sleep well. And rest.